Hello, everyone. My name, for those of you who don't know me, is John Lustria. I'm the Director of Education at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. Thank you all for tuning in and watching with us today. It's a pleasure to be with you. And today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Laurel Lipshutz. Thank you, Laurel, for being with us.
Well, it's my pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure for me to make Dr. Mary Walker more known to this world. She was unknown for so many years, and the more I can promote her, it just gives me great pleasure.
Yes, and as Laurel just mentioned, we're going to be talking about Dr. Mary Walker, one of the, or I think the only woman surgeon of the Civil War, and an incredible advocate on a variety of social issues throughout her lifetime that we're going to get into over the course of the program today. So I personally am greatly looking forward to it. It's always fun to hear where people are watching from. We got Jan from Orlando, Florida, and other folks tuning in. So thanks so much for watching. If you like this video or any of our videos, consider hitting the like button, sharing it, telling people that you know about the program. That's an easy, free way to support the museum. Follow us across all our social medias, Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and now TikTok as of a few months ago. So we're all over the place. That's an easy way to support the museum. If you want to take your support to the next level, consider becoming a member of the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. That's another way to support us. Just $25 a year goes a long way towards supporting programming like this. And I'll post a link in the comments here shortly. And I'll note, as we go through the program today, if anyone has any questions, go ahead and drop them in the comments, and we'll do our best to get to as many as we can. See, we got Holly from St. Louis. Let's see, Bill and Peggy from Garnet Valley, Pennsylvania. Barbara, of course, James from Lexington, Tennessee, Mary from Richmond, Virginia. So it's going to be a lot of fun. So looking forward to getting into this conversation with you all. And again, just chime in with questions and we'll get to as many as we can. So Laurel, let's go ahead and turn this to you. I want to maybe say a little bit about your background for the folks watching, and maybe talk about what first drew you to Civil War era history and to Mary Walker in the first place.
Right. My background is I am a physician. What I do is practice psychiatry. I have been in practice for, I guess, about 45 years or so. I went to medical school at a time where women were more accepted than Dr. Mary Walker, but there was only 3 women in my medical school class. And I also had to deal with a lot of the issues that she dealt with like 120 years before I went to medical school. How I got interested in this is I had no interest in history, or very little, maybe psychiatric history, but certainly not by Civil War history. All I knew about it was what I had learned in high school. And we met some people who were involved in the Confederation of Union Generals, which is a living history group. And they invited my husband to participate with his interest in history, of which he would take on a persona and become a general as a part of this all-male group. And Civil War groups were all-male groups at that point in time. The role that I had, as all the women were, to be wives of these generals, which were usually more of upper class. So I learned how to dress and learn the manners, how to be an appropriate woman in the appropriate clothing of the Civil War. And I was getting a little bit restless and a little bit bored doing that. And one of the times I was in one of the stores that sells all these beautiful clothing that I was buying, hidden in a corner was a book that was titled Dr. Mary Walker. And the owner of the store had no idea who Dr. Walker was. I think someone had just put the book there. That I didn't know much about female doctors during the Civil War, if anything. I bought the book and decided that I was going to read it. And I immediately connected with Dr. Walker. I connected with her as a person. I connected with her as the struggles that she went through. And I said, this is the person that I really want to study and learn about. And that was going to be, I thought that should be my role in the group. Now, you understand this group was an all-male group, and I wanted to now be take on this persona, introduced it to the group, what I felt that I could contribute, as well as all these, all the male members who were generals, who were so dedicated and so experienced and had so much knowledge about the Civil War, but I felt I really could learn about her and contribute. Now, you understand how many years this was. About 10 years ago. This was 150 years after Dr. Mary Walker, and the group really had a very large debate about having a woman participate on an equal basis with the men in this group. And it took over a year before they agreed to allow me to present and to become an honorary member, but not a full member of this group. But that was all right. At least I could present Mary Walker. And from there I certainly became accepted, and I felt like there were other prominent women during the Civil War, and got other women interested in this. And our group now is, I believe, probably the only group that also has not only men, but has women who have personas and are presenting. We are a fully integrated group, which is just remarkable. And so in some ways, I really did identify with Dr. Walker, becoming her and doing some of the things that she did during the Civil War in a very small way.
Right, right. No, that's a very cool story. And before we again dive too much into the life of Mary Walker, I wondered if maybe, and we can maybe revisit this at the end as well, what sources you found helpful as you started kind of putting together your presentation and such. What did you turn towards if people maybe want to learn more in addition to what we covered today?
Right. My sources weren't other people, but initially anyway, my sources were books. The book that got me interested in her was by Mercedes Graff. It was called Woman of Honor. And I think that still is my favorite and best written book in terms of really giving a sense of who this woman was. The other one that I read was by Sharon Harris, called Dr. Mary Walker, an American Radical. This is a very detailed academic book about Mary Walker, and gave me a tremendous amount of information. From there, since Mary Walker is from Oswego, and she is probably the most famous person from Oswego, New York, they have their own city historian. And so I went up there, spent a day with the historian. I saw her birthplace. I also was introduced to a book there by Charles Grout called Dr. Mary Walker, a Reader, which is an excellent summary of Dr. Walker as well. But I think for me, being up in Oswego was, it was life-changing. It was not just my learning about her. At that point, it was my becoming her. I really felt that when I went to her grave and stood on her grave, it felt like she and I united together. And I'm telling you, I'm a totally logical doctor to have these feelings that I was so connected with someone. And it was just significant for me that this happened.
Well, and I think it says a lot of what we talk a lot about here at the museum, the power of place. Going somewhere to these various sites and museums is just so important. There's nothing really that can replace it, no amount of books that you can read.
I would agree. Yes, you have to be there. Yes.
Yeah, it's really incredible. And in case folks, if you missed any of those book titles, this stream will continue to live on both our Facebook page, eventually on the YouTube channel. So you can go back after we wrap up and pause and rewind, and you can get them in that
Yeah,
fashion.
if you wish, I gave you the three prominent books I like, but I have several others that I use, other sources if you're interested, and I can send you a bibliography of what I have. All right.
Sure, yeah. So you can get in touch with us here at the museum. You can either send us a message on Facebook or email us, and we'll connect everyone that needs to get connected.
Mhm.
So okay, let's now get started talking about Dr. Walker herself. Why don't you get us started with her early life and education? Let's get up to the Civil War here, if you could.
Okay. And I think her early history, again, I'm a psychiatrist, but I definitely think her early history so much formed who she was. Her parents, her father was from New England, several generations of Plymouth Meeting. And her father was the oldest son, and his father died. He took care of the family until his mother remarried. At that point, her father was free to explore the rest of the country and decided where he lived, where he wanted to live. And he picked Oswego, New York. He picked upstate New York. And I believe he picked it because it was an area where people were settled, where they were more open in their thinking than other places in the country. He got married, he moved there, and he and his wife had 4 daughters, and then Mary Walker, she was the youngest of the daughters, and then one son. The father had a significant influence on her. He was self-educated. He didn't have formal education. He worked as a carpenter, but he read significantly. One thing that he read was medical books. He wasn't well, and he wanted to figure out what was wrong with him. And so he studied it, reading at his own medical books. And he also became what was called a country doctor. And he was providing general medical care for people in the community as well. His father started the first public school in upstate New York at that point, which was really remarkable. And his father had the Underground Railroad in his home. And so I'm giving you an idea who he was. The father also felt, which was very different in the time, that his daughters should be equally educated with the sons. And at that point that they weren't. And he made sure that Mary Walker was, as well as her sisters, were all educated. She initially went to his school and then went to, it was called Sally Seminary School. It was a private Christian academy where she graduated. Again, all the daughters and the son, all of them were educated. The father also had ideas about dress. And we'll talk a lot more about Mary Walker's dress, but his idea that women should not be in the tight-fitting clothes and the corsets, he felt that that was harmful to them. And he initially instituted loose-fitting clothes for women, which she later adopted to a much greater degree. After she graduated from the Christian school, she was trained to become a teacher, which is really what women could do at that point. She taught for about a year or so, didn't like it whatsoever. She came home, said to her father that, and read a lot of his medical books, and said to him she wanted to become a doctor and go to medical school, which he was totally supportive. And I'm going to say how remarkable that is, because she was not the first female doctor. Elizabeth Blackwell was. She graduated from medical school 5 years before Mary Walker. The other women doctors were not supported by their families. Most of them totally rejected it. She had unconditional support and was very close with her father. Her other sisters became married, fairly wealthy men, actually, and they raised their family. She was the only one that went on and had a career. Now, during this period of time, there were two types of medical schools. The standard one was called the allopathic medical school. This is like Harvard, Penn, that we have now. These medical schools did not admit women. There was a secondary movement called the eclectic movement of medical schools. It was started in Cincinnati, and several of the schools were in upstate New York. Geneseo was the one that Elizabeth Blackwell went to. Mary Walker went to Syracuse Medical College, and she went to that one that was closer to home. To pay the tuition for this medical school, she had saved money from the time that she was teaching, and that's how she paid for the tuition. I should add that the tuition at that point was $55 a session, but that was a lot of money then. And there were, the eclectic medical school was 3 sessions, 13 weeks each. And that was her medical training. They weren't consecutive. She had periods of time in between the sessions, and that's when she did, which is like an internship now. And that's where she learned how to do the care of the patients. The eclectic medical schools did admit women. Although she was the only woman in her class.
Yeah, I was going to say, even though they did admit women, I'm guessing it's probably unusual, even though that was a possibility. There probably weren't a lot of women at the time who attended. Is that right?
There were not a lot. I want to add, you made a comment about the Civil War. There were 300 females, about 300 female physicians during the Civil War.
Okay, thank you for clarifying.
So there were 300 doctors, female doctors. The problem wasn't that there weren't female doctors. They weren't allowed to practice. Mary Walker was the only woman who got a salary. She got a contract to work on the battlefield. I know Dr. Sarah Clapp was another one I'm aware of who volunteered. She never got a contract to work on it. Most of the others never went through the pain and suffering to get accepted, and they worked as nurses. They worked something comparable like a social worker. They weren't allowed to work as doctors, but they did exist.
And it's worth noting too that a lot of the nurses were volunteers as well. Most nurses did not receive a paycheck either.
Some. They began to. The nursing corps, the female nursing corps was started during the Civil War.
Right. Well, the people under,
it was started. Yeah.
The people under Dorothea Dix certainly were paid.
Under Dorothea Dix. That's absolutely right. So it started for the first time. Yes.
Right. But there were also a number who volunteered their time as well.
They absolutely did. And the women, again, the female nursing corps was in the hospitals. They weren't supposed to be on the battlefield. It was still male nurses that were on the battlefield.
Mm-hmm. Right, right.
I don't know if you want to hear more about an eclectic medical school, but my training, say I connect with her. I have to say her training was, their training was more about sanitation. It was about hygiene. It was about general medical care. She only had a little bit of surgical training, and she definitely had less than the standard medical college. This one now would probably be closer to a holistic type of medical training, perhaps osteopathic medical training, even though an osteopathic school also existed somewhat during that period of time, but this was called an eclectic one, but she didn't have as much surgical training. She was one of the valedictorian speakers of her class, even being the female, that she really was recognized and did extremely well in the medical school. After she graduated, it was a fellow classmate that pursued her, and she initially went actually out to Ohio, but he proposed marriage to her and she came back. They got married and settled in private practice in Rome, New York. And a definite problem did occur, that her husband said today what is called an open marriage, that he wanted relationships with other women, and she found that very unacceptable. She grew up in a very religious home. Her father, they were very Christian. They didn't belong to any denomination, though. They went to different churches, but she had very high moral and ethical standards. And she found that what her husband wanted was absolutely unacceptable. And then she went to try to get a divorce. And at some point I could go into that, but it took 10 years. Both being a female, and he was very difficult, and issues about adultery, but it was 10 years before she could get divorced, and very upset and very disillusioned after that. Now she came home after deciding to leave her husband, and she liked adventure. She liked excitement. She was also very patriotic. She initially was thinking of volunteering for the Crimean War and going over to England. It ended before she could do that. But then the Civil War was beginning here. And she said, I want to volunteer. I'm going to offer my services. She got on the train and she went to Washington City and said, I'm going to volunteer. Would you like me just to go ahead and what that was like for her?
Yeah, that's quite an incredible story getting us up to the Civil War. I just wanted to throw in one
Sure.
one thing from the comments. Donna said that they attended college in SUNY Oswego. The medical center there is named after Mary Walker, but they had no idea what her significance was while they were there. This is in the late 60s, early 70s. And
I'm
now they're
sure that's
excited.
true.
Yeah,
Yes.
now she's excited to learn more about her. So just a fun connection to Mary Walker, and she has there's a medical center named after, at least one named after her.
At least one. Yes.
That's pretty cool.
I will eventually go into why she was written out of all the textbooks, especially by the suffragettes. She was absolutely unknown until the last maybe 10 years. Undiscovered, written out, no one knew anything about her, even Oswego. So I really believe that she didn't know much about her.
So yes, getting on to her Civil War service, I know there's a, actually briefly before that, you mentioned that she didn't have a whole lot of surgical experience, and it's worth noting that when people refer to Civil War surgeons, they at the time they used the term surgeon pretty much interchangeably with doctor.
Absolutely. Same
so
thing.
that's
Yes.
worth noting there. But yes, talking about her Civil War experience, I mean, she did all manner of things. She even spent some time in a Confederate prison. I wonder if maybe you could give us the highlights of her Civil War
Sure,
experience.
I would love to. She went to Washington City. She went to volunteer. It was just after the Battle of Bull Run. And there were just hundreds and hundreds of wounded that were coming into the hospitals. And she went to multiple hospitals and they said they would have nothing to do with her. They didn't think any way a woman could be qualified to work as a doctor. She eventually went to the Indiana hospital. This was located in the New Patent office, which was in Washington. And one exhausted surgeon named Dr. Green said, as a volunteer, he was even willing to accept her. He needed help so badly. And so that is what she was doing then. That is where she met Dorothea Dix too. And she did not get along very well with Dorothea Dix. Of course, very few people did get along very well with her. Dorothea Dix felt that women to have any contact with men had to be over 30, should be married, should be very unattractive, which is the only way. And Mary Walker was under 30 and she was very petite neat and very attractive at that point, and Dorothea Dix just didn't know what to do with her. Actually, Mary Walker commented that she really felt her work with the mentally ill was really very good, but as a person, she was terrible. And she felt that she was a horrible person and how she treated her nurses, not just how she was very outspoken, Dr. Walker, more or less how she treated her. And now, while she was working at the Indiana hospital, the other thing that she noticed was that there certainly was not enough care for all the wounded that were in the hospitals. So that the wounded, these men's wives and their mothers or their daughters, were all coming to Washington City to provide additional care and support for their husbands or fathers or whatever. And that, but women at that point who were unaccompanied were called prostitutes. And of course, all these women were unaccompanied because all the men were in the hospitals. Thus, that meant no hotels, no boarding homes would accept them. Even sometimes restaurants wouldn't allow them to come into them. And a lot of these women were living on park benches in Washington City. It's just hard to believe. She was very upset with that. And she went to different people who were politicians. She went to people who had money, and she actually raised enough money to open a boarding home so that these women would have a place to go. From there, they obviously needed more support. She helped organize something called the Washington Relief Association. And that was the start of what women were doing during the Civil War. Different cities had relief associations of women. They organized into the Christian Association, the Sanitary Association, that provided a lot of care, a lot of money for these women. But she started that in Washington. And that is a lot of the work that Dr. Walker really was doing, as well as she was taking care of the wounded. After that, her next thought is she wanted to go on the battlefield. She felt that they needed physicians there, that why shouldn't she go and do it? And she also noticed that again, most of the men during the Civil War died from illness. They didn't die from wounds. It was illness, and that she certainly felt with all of her training about at least some of the ideas that we had about illness at that point and about sanitation, that she could contribute. And she went to Warrenton, Virginia. That was the first place that she went. Then after that, she took a year off and actually had additional training. And it was in hydropathy, which was a new theory that water therapy could be beneficial to these different illnesses. And so she got a different certificate in getting that. And then she went back to the battlefield. She was in Fredericksburg, again, talking to General Burnside, and he actually let her volunteer. She certainly couldn't get a contract, but he did approve of her volunteering. On the battlefield, she was loved by her men, and those she took care of. And she actually was very much appreciated and respected and loved by even the soldiers that weren't wounded. And so there was an opening by General Thomas in the Army of the Cumberland at 52nd Ohio. There was an opening, and this was at the Battle of Chickamauga, which was Chattanooga. And the men actually persuaded him that she could get a contract. Now, before this, Mary Walker had applied to the War Department in order to be able to be approved. And they consistently turned her down. They said she was unqualified. They didn't even interview her. They didn't find out anything about her. It was purely because she was a woman. Some people said it's because she went to an eclectic medical school, but it was really because she was a woman that she was so strongly rejected. And so he gave her a contract. It was more of a salary of a lieutenant, and doctors earn salaries of captains or majors. So she didn't get very much. She was but very pleased to get a contract. She also felt because she had been working, she deserved to get a commission. And why shouldn't she get a commission just like all the other doctors? Of course, she applied to the War Department. Of course, the War Department said absolutely not. She wrote a letter to President Lincoln, and there is a copy of the letter that she wrote and a copy of the response. And she basically gave all the reasons to why she was qualified. And basically, President Lincoln wrote a letter back and said, there wasn't a chance in the world he was going to get involved in this, and he left it to the War Department. So in no way was he really supportive of doing this at all. And I thought that was fascinating, considering who President Lincoln's wife was, but he was not supportive of her getting a commission. After the Battle of Chickamauga, she was tending, there were a lot of wounded in the countryside. She was tending women and children, and there were Southern women and children. She felt everyone deserved care. She was providing medical care to them. And while she was there, she was captured. And they said that she was spying. Now, the issue of spying, we don't know for sure whether she ever was spying or not. Everyone asks me, is there proof? I know that Dr. Walker applied to the War Department to become a spy, and they turned her down. She applied to the Pinkertons, which was a private detective agency at that point, and it was just getting started, and they turned her down. We don't know if she really was spying. It's possible that General Thomas had her spy. We do not have proof of this. One of the things that Dr. Walker didn't do is that she did not keep a diary. Her father wanted her to. She was supposed to do it. She never did it. So we don't have a lot of proof about any of this. She was captured, and she was sent to Castle Thunder, which was one of the horrific Confederate prisons in Richmond. These were old tobacco houses. This was across the street from Libby, which is a little bit better known than Castle Thunder, but basically the same. She was the only female there, the only female in uniform that was in this prison. They did give her a private room, as best as we know. All the other men were crowded in. There are pictures that she seeing her wave from a window there. And sometimes they feel that she had the only room that had a window. More of what I've read, though, is once a week she was allowed out on the porch where she could get fresh air. The rest of the time that she didn't. So at some point, anyway, she was seen waving that she did get some air. But mostly the conditions were horrendous. She had a straw mat. There were rats crawling through. She had vermin in her food. Initially when she was captured, she thought this was exciting. That she had a lot of notoriety from the press. They always called her hermaphrodite because of her dress and wearing pants. But she was initially excited when she volunteered to take care of the wounded that were in the prison, and she was turned down by a horrendous commandant. But after a couple months, it became intolerable to her. She was in the commandant's office, we think, constantly driving him crazy. They kept her alive. And eventually, he probably couldn't, he was sick of her. And she was exchanged for a captain of a Confederate doctor who was the captain, which was quite an honor since she didn't have any rank. When she left the Confederate prison, she lost about half of her vision. She got a muscle infection and wasn't able to see very well after that. And she lost about half, she only weighed 100 pounds. And allegedly, after that, she only weighed like 60 pounds because she didn't eat for 4 months. If that can give you an idea of what the prison conditions were like. As she said, they were the most horrific things that she had ever seen in her life. From there, she actually went to Atlanta. She still had her contract, and so General Sherman had her be there, but she was only there briefly. And then they decided where was she going to go? So they made her medical director of a female prison in Louisville, Kentucky. And she was there for 6 months. Why was she there for 6 months? She found the conditions intolerable. She felt that there was no standards. She felt that the guards were freely having sex. They were mostly prostitutes who were there, but freely having sex with the women there. She felt that nothing was regulated or organized, and she kept writing letters above her. And what they did is they fired her instead. She didn't get anywhere with it. And from there, they had her briefly go to head an orphanage, I think, and then the war was over and her contract was over at that point. I want to add a little bit of what she did. I didn't add when, and a lot more was written when she was at Fredericksburg. And what she assisted in some amputations, which was the main treatment to prevent blood poisoning at that point in time. She felt from her training that there were too many amputations, and I know every general doctor then would completely agree. They felt that they totally saved lives. And she very illegally said to a lot of men who she felt that their wounds weren't serious enough, she told them they could refuse surgery and she would just provide the medical care. But even more than that is these were very young men. They had never been away from home. They were surrounded by all their friends who had either been killed and dying, lying on the battlefield. Their friends who were screaming out in pain from all the wounds. These were the young men who now had amputations. They didn't know how they were going to go back to their farms, how they were going to take care of families if they had them, how were they going to be able to work. And she spent a lot of time giving them support, understanding their emotional pain, but no real name at that point that they gave to it. She wrote letters to their family. She contacted them. She often went on trains and took them back to their families and tried to get them back into their homes. She gave them support and ideas about and hope of how they would be able to work back on their farms and with their families again. I really do think that she, without having the words, she didn't understand about post-traumatic stress, but she was appropriately treating it. And that was a lot of the work she did on the battlefield.
Yeah, that's a great and worthy addition there to highlight the work that she did during the war. And the experience that you laid out that she undertook reminds me a lot of some other folks that we talk a lot about here at the museum, both Clara Barton and Clara Jones, another Civil War nurse whose letters we have in our collection. For both Clara Barton and Clara Jones, just repeatedly going to officials, looking for permission to get to place A, B, or C. I mean, just to be there to offer assistance. I mean, battering down doors just to be there to offer help and assistance. And it sounds like that was certainly the case for Mary Walker as well.
Yes, a lot of the work. Actually, I have one source that she actually worked a little bit with Clara Barton, especially at Fredericksburg. That's where she worked.
I wondered if maybe they crossed paths there.
And they did, I did recently found a source that they did cross paths, and they also, the same type of work is I know Clara Barton was involved in trying to get a registry and finding out who all the dead were and the wounded, and get so that the families were known. And she was actually, Mary Walker was a little bit involved with that as well. So they did have some contact. She also had some contact with Walt Whitman, who, the poet, who worked as a nurse at Fredericksburg, and she had contact with him as well.
And Fredericksburg, the meeting of the minds, as it were.
Yes.
Very cool. Well, our mutual friend Brad Stone in the comments asked a question that I think we might use as a segue here. Brad asked how Dr. Walker developed her uniform, and talk about that, and then that might serve as a good segue to talk about her thoughts about women's dress as a whole.
Sure. She took her father's idea that how women were dressed was unhealthy, and how women during the Civil War were dressed also didn't allow them equality to men. That the standard way that women dressed was very tight corsets. It was large hoop skirts. It was dresses down to the ground. Everything was tight. Their hairstyle was tight. Their shoes were quite narrow. Sometimes women removed their little toe in order to fit into the shoe, if you can imagine. And so she said, women could never be free. They could never be equal dressed like that. And it was also unhealthy. She said, no one should be wearing a corset. You have to be able to breathe adequately. She felt that skirts should not be on the ground. And you understand there was no understanding of microbes or bacteria theory. That didn't exist during that time. But she felt that it was unhealthy. It brought up dirt and it made people sick, and you cannot have it on the ground. And she felt, but freedom of movement was through wearing pants, and that women had to wear pants. And so she designed her own uniform, and she had her own uniforms made, and she designed her own clothes even before the uniforms, which was pants, which is skirt to the knees. She said, I am definitely female. And she is quoted, I am female, and this is the appropriate way that a woman should dress. So it was a skirt to the knees, no corsets. On the battlefield, she let her hair loose and long with curls, big long curls, not the short hair. For formal pictures, it is how I am dressed right now, where she put it back into a bun, but that's all it was. It's still loose and back into a bun. She felt it should be square-toed, wide boots that women should wear. And she felt this was the healthy way to produce freedom of movement, and designed this uniform exactly like this. I want to add, my uniform, you only can see the top of it, but obviously I am fully clothed, fully dressed, just like what I'm wearing now. Mary Walker would walk the streets of New York in this uniform. Every time she was seen, she was arrested. The police said this was indecent dress, this was impersonating a man, and she was put in jail overnight. And this happened over and over again. It happened during the Civil War, and when she was even out of uniform and dressed in this style. After the war, every time. There's even described the court hearing that she had, and what they had to do to convince the judge that this was appropriate. And they said she got too much attention and caused riots because of how she was dressed, the police. But it was totally considered inappropriate for a woman to dress in this style. And this got her into controversy and difficulties throughout the rest of her life, actually.
Man, woman being able to breathe freely. What a radical idea.
Then it was a radical idea. I want you to understand women who are pregnant still wear corsets. They loosened the ties on the corsets, but they still had to wear a corset.
Wow, that's wild. Now, of course, any conversation about Mary Walker is sort of incomplete without the numerous causes after the war, well, and even during the war as well, that she advocated for. And I want to sort of roll this into a
Mhm.
question we got in the comments here from Robert Smith. He asked that histories seem to often refer to Mary Walker as an abolitionist. How did that affect the care she provided? Did she give medical care to Black soldiers?
Um, my assumption is that she did. I have not found anything written about it. She was not tremendously involved in abolition. It's interesting they say that. I mean, I assume that she would with her father running the Underground Railroad. There is not a lot written about her and her treatment of Black soldiers and about abolitionism. That was not something she really got involved with. Her passion was women's rights and suffragettes. Women's rights, women's equality. That was her cause. I don't think she invested a lot in abolition.
Interesting. Well, I wondered if maybe you could talk a bit about her work with the women's rights movement.
Um, let's see. Let me start with after the Civil War and pensions, which was a very big deal with this. First thing is Mary Walker came from a poor family. She didn't have money. Um, there's always rumors about her that she was wealthy. She didn't have any money at all. After the Civil War, she went to England and lectured and talked about dress and appropriate dress. And she did this as a way to earn money. And England was a little more accepting of her dress than they were in this country. After the Civil War, all the men who participated in the war got a pension. None of the women did. This is where the female nursing corps that was started during the Civil War, none of the women got pensions. And she, who had a contract, she didn't get a pension either. And so she spent a lot of her time now, as I would say, like a lobbyist in Washington and all those departments, trying to get a pension, both for herself and for all the other women that served in the Civil War. And she spent a lot of time doing that. And eventually she actually, along with other women as well, she succeeded in the nursing corps, did get pensions. She did not succeed for herself, and she was not able to get one. And so she still needed a source of money. Um, Before I even go into her other rights, I want to add a story which was really significant here. You know that she is the only woman who's ever been awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. And again, what was read, why she got it is because of all the care that she gave for the wounded and because of her imprisonment, that she was in the prison. And actually, General Sherman wrote a letter saying that she was reporting on troop movements to him. So a combination of all this is why she got the Medal of Honor. And it was President Johnson who did award it to her, and the only woman that it was awarded. But it was also felt, especially at the time, that perhaps she was awarded it in place of getting a pension. And because she couldn't get it, that this is the reason they give it. Now, Mary Walker very clearly said, I got it because I deserved it, which was true. She definitely did deserve it. But there are several reasons that have been stated why she might have gotten it. But she did, yeah.
And if we could quickly stay on the Medal of Honor thing, I want to pick up the thread with the women's rights movement. But
Okay.
as I understand it, there's a bit of controversy even after her death, with that particular Medal of Honor. Is now a good
Right.
time to talk about that?
We can. Yeah. I
Yeah,
went into other
let's
thing
do
because
that.
it came before her issues with suffragette. That came a little bit later. So I'm just trying to do, but I certainly, the Medal of Honor in 1917, they changed the criteria for the Medal of Honor. They said it was only for meritorious service on the battlefield. They felt during the Civil War, many Medal of Honors were just given out to just about anyone. And so they were rescinded, and they did rescind hers as well. Not that she ever gave it back, and of course that she kept it, but she was taken off the rolls. She said it was always hers and she always deserved it. It was reinstated. It was her grandniece that went to President Carter in 1977, and he reinstated her Medal of Honor.
Gotcha. Thank you for tying that up,
Sure.
putting a bow on that. Now go ahead and continue.
So before I go into her work with the suffragette, I want to add that her struggles after the war just to have enough money so that she could survive. After she couldn't get the pension, she said, well, maybe what I need to do is to get a job in government. And especially the Department of Pensions is where she wanted the job. So you can imagine when she applied for it, what would happen? Of course, they turned her down. Now, she didn't find that acceptable. And at this point, it was President Grant. Now, the White House was open then. And so she tried to talk to President Grant, and he never responded to her. So what she did is she took her mat, she took her cooking equipment, and she moved into the East Room of the White House and laid there and said, I'm not going to leave until you give me a job. And he let her stay there for 2 weeks. After 2 weeks, he finally came out and he said to her, all right, I'll give you a job, but you have to dress like a woman and can't dress like this. And he was very much opposed to her mode of dress, even before that in the White House. That's probably why he wouldn't speak with her as well. She agreed to move out then. She said he offered her a job. Obviously, she would never change her mode of dress, but she did move out. What was really interesting is after that, Mrs. Grant said, this will never happen again. And the White House had a fence and they closed it off and it stopped being an open White House. I do think she had a lot to do with that because of her actions. But she took things in her own hands. Yes. Now, what was really interesting is after that, someone in government offered her a job in one of the departments. She was offered it twice, but this was really right after she left the White House. She was offered a job and she went to work, and the job locked her out and they wouldn't let her. She was given, I think, like a 2-year contract to work in the department, but she was never allowed to go in and be there. And obviously, she never got a salary. She never got any money. She wasn't allowed to. And she spent many years petitioning the government to give her a salary and pay her for the contract for the job that she was offered, which they would never let her go in and work. Years later, she applied again for a job, and this time they put her as a mail clerk. She still needed an income, and so they put her in the mailbox. Well, what did Mary Walker do? She decided she was going to organize the whole mail department in the government. She wouldn't be a clerk. She would say, this isn't running right. This isn't running right. This is how it has to be organized. She went to reorganize these things, and she was fired very rapidly.
That seems like the Mary Walker experience in a nutshell right there.
I want to give you a sense of who this woman was. Yes.
Yeah.
And this
No,
is how she pursued things. Yes.
That's a great story. Well, we're headed towards the end of our time here. And, here at the museum, we always strive to connect the past to the present. And the story of Mary Walker is so incredible in so many ways. And I wondered if maybe you could list a few reasons or a few ways that Mary Walker's story is still relevant for us today.
I think more relevant than ever. I think women have had to fight to be equal forever. We have made progress. We've continued to work on it. I certainly, when I did my training in medical school in the 70s, and this was a period of time where there was a lot of protests, and we really made progress more in equality of women and in the medical field and all professions and all areas. Then and in some ways, I worry that we've become a little bit laid back about it. And now, in our present time, we're going back to questioning all the things that maybe we have won along the line in terms of reproductive rights. I think overall equality of women. And I think we have to learn from Mary Walker that we can't be laid back about it, that we have to take charge. We're going to have to fight. We're going to need to be put down about it. So I really, I think we need to learn from our history. History gets repeated. And I think in our present time, right now, it is just critically important for all of us to take a little bit of Mary Walker inside of us and be a little more like her.
Yeah, that's well put. Yeah, I think you're certainly right that her story's more relevant than ever, and I think there's a lot that her persistence, her dedication, her, like you said, she certainly was not laid back, and there's just a lot of really noble traits, and certainly a life lived very incredibly, as I think you've done a great job of sort of laying that out for us
Can I
today
add
in as
one
brief a
thing?
time
I
brief a
know
time
we're
as we
running
have.
out of time. I wanted to mention the book that she wrote,
Oh,
which was
yes,
so
please.
important. She wrote a book called Hit, Essays on Women's Rights. It was and she wrote it in 1871. I will be brief because she was so ahead of her time about her medical ideas. She wrote about 8 different areas. I'm going to just briefly mention 3 critical ones. One, men came back from the war. They were heavily addicted to alcohol and to opiates, which was laudanum. And when they came back in their addiction, they emotionally were far more out of control, often very violent in the family. And she wrote about domestic abuse and what the women needed to do about it. And obviously alcohol needed to be stopped in the drugs. And she recognized that, but I'll talk a lot about domestic abuse, way ahead of her time before this got picked up. The other thing she talked about was only men smoked then, and she felt smoking was very bad for the health. It was bad for the health of the men, but she talked about it was bad for the health of the women and children and probably shortened their lifespan. She wrote about secondhand smoke in 1871. We didn't talk about this until, what, 150 years, 200 years later before we talked about secondhand smoke. It was just amazing what she was able to think about.
Absolutely, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And thank you for highlighting that. This has been incredible. Thank you so much for joining us today, Laurel. Really appreciate it.
It is absolutely my pleasure. I really believe that I want Mary Walker known, and I want a little bit about her in every one of us.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. So we hope you all enjoyed the program. Everyone tuning in, thanks for watching. Again, stay an easy, free way to support the museum. Follow us across all our social medias. And if you want to take your support to the next level, consider becoming a member of the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. As low as $25 a year supports programming like this. And we really appreciate everyone who has joined in the past couple years here. Next week, we'll be back, I believe, next Friday, talking about the Browns Island explosion, munitions factory explosion, and the medical care for its victims in Richmond. So that should be a good conversation. Looking forward to being with you all next week. And until then, this is John and Laurel signing off.